Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Is Data Too Hot to Handle in DevExtreme Mobile? Presented by DevExpress CTO Julian Bucknall and DevExpress Technical Evangelist Paul Usher. It goes without saying that every application needs data and some need it there and then, whereas others can wait for it to arrive across the web. In this presentation, Paul and Julian will look at using data in your mobile DevExtreme app, especially that data which has to reside on the device. They will discuss what storage options are available out of the box and how to choose one, how to implement a custom data store, how to use local storage on the device, and they will even take a look at on-device debugging techniques. This session is being recorded and it will be available on our DevExpress YouTube channel later today. We will also do a live Q&A at the end of this presentation. Just type your questions in the GoToWebinar control panel at any time throughout the broadcast. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Julian and Paul.
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar for 2016. And of course, good morning, Julian.
Hello, Paul, and hello, everybody, and welcome to this first webinar. I do hope there are going to be more of them. We seem to be a little slow off the bat today, this year, so, but I know we have a few lined up.
We certainly do, and some exciting ones coming up. But today we're going to focus on data, in particular with mobile apps and hybrid apps. So is data too hot to handle in DevExtreme? And what do we actually mean by that? Well, we're going to look at all the different ways that we can handle data inside that hybrid scenario. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on why we got to this stage or why the webinar came about. And then as a bit of a shake-up, we're going to get Julian to do some coding.
Oh no, what? You said you were going to do it.
Being the JavaScript ninja you are, I'm sure you'll be able to cope just fine. Now, whenever I teach mobile development, there's one key principle or one golden rule, and that is that people should always design with offline in mind. It doesn't matter how good a device you have or how fast your connection is, there are going to be times where your user cannot access the internet. Only last month, or actually this month in Australia, the largest telco went offline. We couldn't make calls and we couldn't use data for a number of hours across the entire country. So if you're a user, you've got an application, you don't want to be stuck in a scenario where you can't do something. Another thing to think about is if I'm developing, say, a sales order application and I've got a product list of 10,000 items, I don't want to be hitting the server every time that happens. I want to have that stuff cached. But because we're talking about a hybrid solution where DevExtreme is packaged with the likes of PhoneGap or Cordova, and we're working inside a web view or a browser package on the device, we don't get all the straightforward options you would in a native environment. What I'm going to do is step through some of the technologies available to browsers for data storage. And then from there, Julian can, as I said, expand a little bit on some of those and put together a couple of examples. Now realize that in the description of the webinar, we said that we were going to do some advanced debugging. When we got to writing that part of the webinar, we discovered that it's actually really, really fun and cool, but quite intricate. So what we're going to do is an entire webinar dedicated to debugging a DevExtreme app using some third-party tools in a couple of weeks. All the examples we use today, you can debug straight in your web browser, which will make it a fair bit easier. So what technologies are available or storage options are available inside DevExtreme Mobile or PhoneGap? If we think about browsers in general, we've got the fact that we can use cookies. Now, cookies have been around probably since Julian was a boy.
Knee-high to my grandmother's knee, cookies were around, I think.
Generally used for small storage, but transmitted to the server. Cookies are there just for that, capture the user details maybe, or some authentication token, things like that. Not really suitable for storing any volume of data. Next we have web storage. Some people refer to this as DOM storage or local storage and session storage. One interesting side fact, if you're using a private browser session in something like Safari or Safari on iOS, any calls to local storage will be treated as session storage. Now, local storage allows you to keep a certain amount of information, a lot more than cookies, on the device. Session storage, the idea being that when the web view is destroyed, the session data is destroyed with it. Now, what's interesting here is people often refer to web storage or local storage to have a limit of about 5 megabytes. One could consider that that's a fair amount of data, but in actual fact, that's a bit of a furphy. See, it's not a matter of 1 byte equaling 1 character. Because of the Unicode character set, 1 byte or 1 character equals 2 bytes. So that 5 megabyte supposed limit is realistically about 2.5 meg, thus making it quite a challenge to use with real data sources. Again, while we were doing our research, I sent Julian a couple of example files from a native iOS app, and one of those files alone was 8.5 meg. So it's not going to be suitable when you're dealing with some of those type of scenarios.
And the other thing to realize, I think, is that web storage, you're basically storing JSON objects, so everything is a string. So that's the important thing to note. It's not like you have lots of binary data. It's a lot of it is just string data. So hence the 2 bytes per character problem.
Now, the other thing with web storage is that it's usually not sent to the server, or it's not sent to the server, but it is well supported across browsers. The big issue is that limit on size. If you're dealing with a small application where you know for a fact that you're not going to be having more than that 2.5 meg imposed limit, it's usable. But what you don't want is for users to be emailing or phoning up saying, hey, I'm getting this quota exceeded error inside my application, and then you have to go off and start researching other supported technologies. Now, the next entry in the kit here is what they call offline storage. Now, this is a HTML5 thing where you can actually package your application and assets to work in an offline mode. Talking more traditional browser here, the issue is that that's not really going to suffice when you want to talk about user data, and it is a HTML5 thing. We'll touch on this a little bit more shortly when it comes to file APIs, and of course things like plugins, because I know that with PhoneGap you can get plugins to support native file writing. The additional headache with that is the minute you start using plugins, the minute you start using hardware abstraction layers and things like that, you're then dealing with a more difficult debugging experience, which we'll go into in that debugging webinar. If you're wanting to keep it as simple as possible, we want to use what the browser has available, cross-platform, cross-browser. Next in line, we've got WebSQL, and this one, it's really just a big sigh. WebSQL has been deprecated. It's no longer supported. So much so that Mozilla didn't implement it inside their browser. The really big frustration here is that WebSQL is supported in most mobile browsers. Now remember, we're talking mobile apps, we're talking data in mobile apps, so WebSQL will be great. It's already there in the browsers, but because it's a deprecated technology, you need to stay away from it, which is a real frustration. Instead, people start talking about IndexedDB. The great thing with IndexedDB is that it's object-based, it supports a large amount of data, and the downside is it's not universally supported. Now, Tim Cook in his keynote last year was quite happy to say that yes, IndexedDB is now supported in Safari. The problem is in Safari iOS, it's still very, very buggy, and unless you want all the headaches of trying to have your software not work on some devices and on others, you've got to stay away from things that are not yet universally supported. Now, in the future, we're hoping that IndexedDB becomes a lot more solid. I'm talking we as global developers here, not as DevExpress as a company. So that sporadic support then rolls into the likes of the HTML5 file system or the file system APIs. Again, because it's so that the support isn't as widely spread as we want, it is something that is very difficult to start trying to implement in a application that you've got that cross-platform, cross-browser consideration. File system's great with plugins. Plugins are a pain if you're debugging locally. Back to that complicated process. Now, to back up some of the items that I've been talking about here, we've got a few slides. We can see that web storage, great way to store things, universally supported, except for Opera Mini, which I'm not sure lots of people will be using and doesn't really affect that mobile scenario, that hybrid development approach. The biggest problem, of course, is that limit of size of what you can store. So whilst it's a great option, it's got green ticks across all the browsers, it's not really suitable for large data. So we look at IndexedDB. We can see that in Firefox and Chrome and Opera, really cool. Android browser, green, but there's only partial support in the Microsoft browsers. And as I mentioned before, iOS 8.9, which it was introduced in, is seriously buggy. So you don't want to be dealing with that technology that's going to just give you headaches. Next along the line, Web SQL, we're starting to see those red things appear across. The frustration, Safari supported, iOS Safari supported, Android browser supported. It's almost perfect for what we want, but because it's no longer being maintained and supported, could be dropped at any time, leaving your application unusable, dead in the water. And then finally, the file system and file writer API. Chrome, Opera, and Chrome for Android, the only thing that supports it without plugins. And again, it's something that could be dropped at any time. So the frustrations. Hopefully, as HTML5 becomes more embedded, the file system gets more taken up by other vendors, we can start to see that. But you've got to think, we're talking Android, we're talking Microsoft platform, and we're talking the Apple platform, iOS, and you've only got 1 out of 3 at that point. Now, all these charts that I've been showing you are all available on a great website. Julian, if you could bring that up. And it's caniuse.com. And what's really nice here, any JavaScript function that you want to use and you want to see the functionality across browser, so let's say the drag and drop function. I want to implement that into my application. I just click on it and it's going to show me the compatibility across multiple browsers, which is really, really handy. It's a great resource to keep bookmarked. It's nice and simple to remember, so caniuse.com, and it's well maintained, showing what is available across that. Of course, gone are the days where inside our JavaScript we have to try and be browser dependent. We don't say if the browser is Netscape, do this, and Internet Explorer, do that. There's a lot cleaner ways to do that. And that's probably a great time, Julian, to plug a webinar that you're planning on JavaScript for Dummies.
Not a JavaScript for Dummies. I'm going to be presenting a webinar in the fairly near future on writing JavaScript in a functional style. And so functional style means basically taking ideas from things like F# and OCaml and all those kind of good things and seeing how you can implement them with JavaScript. The heading, if you like, is higher order functions. What are higher order functions and how they work, and we'll see how that goes. You're playing
Excellent.
around with my browser here. What's going on?
I was just looking at some of the can I use features, but that's pretty cool. If you could jump back to the PowerPoint, please. Now,
Sure.
Of course, whenever you choose a third-party library or a library to work with, you've got some serious considerations. And a lot of people often say, look, I'm just going to use open source. I want to do this because it's free or there's community support. But of course, in that consideration, we've always got to be careful that you don't get caught up having to rework major parts of your application. And I'm not sure how many of you out there have seen this or know about this, but for example, on the next slide, we can see that support for Parse server is going into a sunset clause, and they're actually closing the hosting service as of January next year. if I was a developer that had spent a fair bit of time working to talk to the PaaS backend, it even says in their documentation here, the migration process is non-trivial to move away from PaaS. So it's just one of those things where you've got to be really quite careful with the partnering that you choose. I'm a big advocate of using things like Microsoft Azure for the back end. Of course, you can then run a number of different servers and database servers, CouchDB, Mongo, etc. in that scenario. In the research that we did for this particular webinar, we came across a really cool little library, which Julian's going to show you how to implement inside DevExtreme shortly. The library that we came across was one called Pouch. Now, PouchDB, wait for the screen to update. It's a lightweight JavaScript database, and what's really cool is it allows offline use. So everything you do inside Pouch, would just think of it as a object database that you can run inside your mobile application. It does have full support for synchronizing back to a CouchDB or any compatible server implementing the CouchDB sync protocol. When it comes to working with data on a mobile device, I'm not a big fan of using replication and trying to do this online-offline sync. I think you should grab the data on the device, do what you want, and then use Web API or web services to push the data back and do whatever validation and business rules you want in the back end. And this certainly fits that. Now, the reason that we've chosen it to look at it today is it's very easy to wrap inside a DevExtreme custom data store. So I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Julian and take a look at things like local store, array store, and then a little bit more complicated, how we can build an application with PouchDB.
So, thank you, Paul. So PouchDB, it's an open source project. Essentially, it doesn't tell you how it stores data, so it's something you don't have to worry about. It's cross-browser capable, so they worry about the capabilities of the browser and where data can be stored or cannot be stored and all the rest of it. It works on a small device. It works on a desktop browser, as we'll be showing you here. It's very lightweight. It's a complete JavaScript translation of CouchDB, so it helps if you're using CouchDB as your main server out there on the cloud somewhere. And as you can see from this little I don't know, demo code, I suppose, it's very easy to set up and use. You're just going to include the PouchDB JavaScript minified file, and from then on you're basically going to be doing things like this, where you're going to create a new database, or if that name already exists, then you're going to be opening it. Here we are putting a record. We're have events and event handlers on the database and what's happening with the database, and you have this kind of easy way of replicating your data to somewhere out on the internet, in the cloud, on Azure, because after all, Paul is an Azure MVP. I just thought I'd throw that in there. Well done, Paul.
Thank you. Just one point there on PouchDB, Julian. Yep. If you do want to specify the particular type of storage that is used, whether it be IndexedDB, WebSQL, then you can force that. But one of the really nice things in the documentation is letting it do what it does best. And their tagline is the database that can.
Right. And the other great thing about it is they'll work out any issues that you have browser-wide or platform-wise. So PouchDB is the one I'm going to be showing you, and what we're going to do is, what I'm going to do is create a custom data store using PouchDB. We don't have one at the moment, and it'll be a great way of showing you how extensible and flexible DevExtreme is with regard to data, and in fact that data is not too hot to handle. So let me just show you the my mind went blank. Let me show you the structure of a DevExtreme data application. If you Recall DevExtreme is a model view model type system. It's a single page application for a framework for mobile devices. And so we have up at the top there in the blue, we have our view. So we have some kind of list widgets, we have an edit form, and then underneath that we have the view model, and the view model will then have information about the models themselves. The model in DevExtreme is called a store, and here we have in green the store. It has a certain API to it, so there's a load method which loads a group of records, a set of records, insert a record, remove, delete a record, update a record. By key is the read method, so given a key, read the record for that key, and then there's some other ancillary ones such as total count, which gives you a count of records. Now for a normal small widget that only requires one, can only work with one particular record, that's all you need is a data store of some description. And we have various different types of data store in DevExtreme. We can have a store which uses an array within the code. I'll be showing you that. There's a local store which uses local storage. There's no data store, so here we are, suddenly we're going across the web to some kind of server and using OData to transfer data back and forth. We've added a couple more. We have one for Breeze, we have one for JData, we also have one for Parse. That's up on GitHub. And then there's this thing called Custom Store, which is the one I'm going to be using right now to show you how easy it is to implement another database library within DevExtreme. Now for lists, it's slightly different. Lists or grids, they have multiple records. You need to be able to process a set of records. You need to sort them, you need to group them, filter through them, select the ones you want. We also provide events such as, has data changed and so on and so forth. And so we have this data source generic kind of class called a data source which uses inside it a store. So that's the structure of the data access part of DevExtreme, if you like, the interaction between the view model and the model itself. Data source, just leave alone, give it a store, and it's the store which does all the magic, actually accesses the records and so on and so forth. So without further ado, let us just quickly jump into our favorite IDE and Visual Studio, and I have a small application, and like every other small application out there which works as an example of some library or framework, it's a to-do list application. So if you're good on React, for example, React is a to-do list. So what I'm doing here right to begin with, I'm going to be using an array store. And here's my data array of my data. I have 3 items. Oh my God, I use some bad programming here. But I have 3 items in my to-do list. Some of them haven't been done, one has been done. And basically I'm going to create this new data store, this new array store, I should say, pass in the data array and tell DevExtreme what the key name is. I'm just going to run this. We'll particularly go through what the code looks like behind, but here we are. And so it throws up a little login screen. It's a very stupid login screen at the moment. You can type in anything you like, providing there's an even number of characters. So luckily, Julian is an even number of characters. And those are the items that were in my data array. So, oh, I've fed the cats. So I can now complete that and save it. And notice that the display of the list is grouped. We have items still to do, which is finish the app. I'm just about ready to finish the app. And what I've done is I've planned the webinar and I've fed the cats, which is pretty cool. And you can, if I come out of that now, just show you how easy it is to ungroup. Let's move that out of the way. The item there was in the feed, so I've got grouped equals true here. I'm just going to delete that, go to my view model for the feed, and take out this item here, which is the how I'm going to be grouping. So the HTML said, oh, you're going to be grouping, and this is exactly how I'm going to be grouping. So we're separating concerns here. Delete that, and now we'll just run the application again and bring it back over. Actually, I'm going to be clever and switch. So Julian, DX, and sign in. And now I have no grouping at all. So as you can see, it's very easy to add things like have a list of items, group them with the array store, and so on and so forth. But of course, the big problem about the array store is when I close the application, the data just goes away. There is no permanent storage. The data array is, in fact, just part of the code. So there's no way of persisting it is the word. So the next step along is to show you how easy this is. I'm going to basically, I'm not going to use an array anymore. I'm going to be using a local store. What the local store does is use local storage to store the data. Now what I've got here is, so it's again, it's a class that we provide as part of DevExtreme. I've just given it a name of DX-to-dos, so that's the name of the database I'm going to be creating, and again I just specify what the key is. So now, without any other changes whatsoever, I'm going to rerun this application and log in, really boring, and here we're getting data from the local store. I set up these items to do, these to-do items earlier on today, so they were stored as part of my local storage in the browser. So I have this thing called write demo app. I think I've completed that one. It must be pretty good. Yep. And again, it works in exactly the same way. Now recall, all I've done here is to change the store being used by the data source. That's all I've done. So still to do, we have to cheer when when the webinar's done. Can't do that yet. But that's how simple it is in DevExtreme to switch from one store to another. So let me come out of that and go back into my my items here, and the one thing I do want to show you inside the view model is what's actually happening. We're creating a data source in the view model by using the data source constructor and passing to it a configuration object. Within DevExtreme, this is how a lot of things work. You have a constructor, you new up an object from that constructor, and you pass into it a configuration object that tells the object what to do and how to do it and all the rest of it. So the data constructor, the data source constructor basically says, okay, we need a configuration, we need to know what the store is, and that's the name of the store, that's the object that contains the store. We're going to select these fields from the records, and we're going to group by the done field, which is that field there. As it happens, this particular set of records, it only has those 4 fields, but you can imagine selecting just a subset of fields and so on and so forth. So to-do DB to-dos, to-do bidi biday, is this thing. So to-do, I've been changing the DB here. So to-do DB to-dos is this local store. So now let's kill that thing, as it were, and then talk about PouchDB. Now here we're going to have to create a custom store. So there's no code there yet, and the custom store, when we create it, we pass it a configuration object which has basically a set of methods in it. There's a load method, where are we? Whoops. A by key method, which is the one which reads a record, an insert, update, remove. Those are the only ones I'm specifying as part of this particular store. So the custom store has no ability to read or write data at all. You provide the methods which do so. And the interesting thing about DevExtreme is it recognizes that data operations by themselves tend to take time. You can't synchronously go and get some data. And that's the assumption that DevExtreme makes, is that it takes time. So it uses what are called promises. And I don't know, some of you may be saying, promises? What? Some of you would go, oh yeah, promises, no sweat. So in essence, JavaScript provides the ability, JavaScript promises provide the ability to have asynchronous processing. The thing to realize here is JavaScript is single-threaded. And what that means is, obviously, two chunks of code cannot run at the same time. The interpreter will run one first and then run the other one second. But in browsers, it's even worse. The JavaScript interpreter shares that thread with a bunch of other processing. There's rendering that occurs on the same thread. Style updates which cause re-rendering, that's on the same thread. Handling user actions, that's on the same thread, and so on and so on and so forth. Now, if one of these actions just takes a long time, everything else just gets delayed. That's why in JavaScript, you don't do major data processing in a big loop, for example. Everything will freeze and the user gets annoyed and then basically rants incessantly to the developer, and the developer is you. The thing is, lots of stuff that JavaScript does involves a delay. So the most familiar of these is the good old AJAX call. Some client-side code wants some data from a distant server out there, so it issues an AJAX request, and as part of the request, it declares a callback function that will be called when the data you requested arrives some long time later. Internally, the callback function gets put on a special queue, and then the code that issues the AJAX call just terminates. It's done. It terminates synchronously. It doesn't wait for the data to arrive. Now, once the data arrives and the interpreter is not actually running any other code, the callback is going to be popped off the queue, executed with a return value from the server. Now, all this kind of processing is now done by promises. So promises are, if you like, a special chunk of code that will take some time to complete. You don't want to wait for that process, whatever the heck it is, to complete. You can declare two main callbacks for it. The one that gets executed when the processing was successful, and the one that gets executed if there was an error. Now, over the years, there have been multiple libraries that implemented promises. jQuery uses one called deferred. PouchDB uses one called lie. In ECMAScript 6, we're supposed to get some special keywords like async and wait, but that's still a long way off, so we don't have to worry about promises when that happens. And if you're a C# programmer, you know what async and wait can do. Now, DevExtreme, as I said, makes this firm assumption about its stores. All data access takes time, therefore all data accesses are synchronized through promises. The promises it uses are, in fact, jQuery deferred objects. Now, to be honest, just like debugging on a device, asynchronous programming using promises is a webinar in and of itself. So perhaps I'll get Paul to do it later on this year. Good on you, Paul?
Sorry, I just fell off my chair.
So here in our store that we're declaring, in our configuration object for the store, we're going to be declaring a method called byKey. And what byKey does is, given a key, it reads the record for that key. And every single one of these methods I'm going to be describing does exactly the same thing is a preamble and afterwards. First of all, it creates a jQuery deferred object, and just before it finishes, it returns the promise from that deferred object. So DevExtreme requires the promise from a jQuery deferred. Now here's the actual interesting stuff for ByKey, for example. It's db.get, which is, oh, I forgot to show you. We're going to create a new database called to-dos, or if it exists, we're going to open it. So that's that bit, and I'd rather write db than to-do.PouchDB. So I'm just using that as a temporary variable, if you like. So back to ByKey. So db, that's the PouchDB object. I'm going to call its get method. I'm going to pass it a key. Now, as I said, PouchDB is also asynchronous. So this will return immediately without the data. So you have to give it a function, a callback, to be called when the data has been retrieved. And in lie, which is what PouchDB uses, that's called then. So we say .then, and .catch is for an error. So we get this kind of continuation style, which is very functional programming style. This returns a promise, a different type of promise than jQuery's. Man, I wish that promises were all the same, but they're not. Then defines a method to call once the data has arrived. Catch defines a function to call if there is an error. And if the thing was successful, I'm just going to basically get the resolve function method of the deferred object to execute, and ditto, or same thing for if there's an error, I'm going to get the reject function to be called. And basically the data gets transferred through the then to the resolve and through the catch to the reject, whatever data there is that comes back from this. So all of these methods do create a deferred, do some work, set up the various callbacks, and then return the promise. ByKey is the easiest one to do. Insert, let's have a quick look at insert. Create the deferred, and we're going to return the promise at the end. Here we're just basically going to say, okay, we need a new object that we're going to be saving. Here are the values coming from the edit form. I need to add an ID field. Now, PouchDB actually requires an ID field, and it's, as far as I understand, it has to be called _ID. Pouch is essentially a key value store, and so we need a key. We can't just throw things into some table as a big old list without keys. So all I'm doing here is just using the current date time essentially as a string. And then I call the put method of the database, PouchDB database, passing it the object. That will execute immediately, and you return this. But we're going to be declaring a then callback, and that's the function that's going to get executed once the data has been put. We can get some data back of some description. I'm going to pass it to the resolve method. In fact, I'm going to pass the ID back to the resolve method. And then if there's an error, blah, blah. Update, same thing. Deferred, create one, return the promise at the end. The way we have to do it with PouchDB is we go and get the record, the original record, and then for the callback we say we're going to do this. And what's the callback going to do? It's going to get a record. We're going to extend that record with the new values, and then there's going to be another callback, which we're just going to resolve the original promise, the original deferred, and if there's an error we're going to reject the original deferred. Ditto for this one, which goes with that then. So here we have essentially two calls which are going to take time, two calls which have to execute asynchronously and return the promise. And the same with the remove here. Create the deferred, return the promise. And again, the way it works with PouchDB is we have to get the record, And once we get the record, once the record arrives, then we can remove it completely, and then we have the then and the catch. So all that was a little complicated, but still fairly simple. You have to understand enough about promises and about how they work, about async programming and how that works to be able to do this kind of development. Now the interesting thing is all these functions here are basic CRUD functions. By CRUD I mean create, read, update or delete. They're basic functions. So simple widgets, that's all they use are these functions. And then we get to the list style functions, which as we showed earlier on requires the object, the store, to load a set of records. Load function then is going to be a lot more complicated. So we have the load function, which is where I'm going to declare it here. It's a function that has a configuration object passed to it, the load options configuration object. There's a whole bunch of things in here which are there to help you understand what's needed to be loaded from the database, so you can restrict the number of records to be loaded and so on and so forth. For us, we only have one option in this particular application, and that's the grouping option. So if I go down to the actual code for this particular method, I am going to be loading up the group property from the load options configuration object. If I jump over to the feed here, it's this thing. This is going to be passed to that load method together with the select statement here. These are going to be basically copied over to a new configuration object and then passed over inside data source, passed over to its underlying store. So back at the store, we get the group property. It's the name of a field, so let's put it in a variable called name, field name. If that property wasn't actually there, then whatever it is, the list is just requesting an unordered and ungrouped list. So if the field name was undefined at this point, we're going to be executing this statement. If the field name was defined, we're going to be executing this statement. Let's look at load ungrouped for now, as it's the easiest one to see. So load ungrouped, here we are, and we create our deferred object, and we're going to return the promise. And if you look down below, we're just going to return whatever load ungroup returns, so we're not particularly bothered in the outer function here. So PouchDB uses a function called alldocs. There's also a query type function as well, but that's probably overkill for what I'm doing here. Alldocs requires its own configuration object. The configuration object I'm going to use is one that just has one property called include docs. Because PouchDB is a key value store essentially, they call their records documents or docs. So what this particular configuration object is saying is all docs will just return the keys. That's all it will do. All I'm saying here is include the values as well, please, because that's what we really need. So we call all docs. That's going to execute immediately. We go through the promise thing, and we're going to declare a callback here for the it's been successful. This function is going to get executed. This is where another bit gets complicated. PouchDB returns the data in a weird format, let's put it like that. But part of that is a rows array, data.rows, so data is the whole thing. Data.rows are the actual records, but each record is has some properties, and then the actual record itself, or the object itself, is known as doc. So what I've done here is Data.rows is an array. I'm using the map function, and I'm going to do this mapping for every record that I come across. So for each to-do item, I'm going to return the doc property of that to-do item, which is the object itself. Map takes an array and returns another array. That's what map does. By the way, if you don't know these functional type methods of arrays, they are well worth learning. Essentially, map iterates through all the items in this array, calls this function on every single item, and then builds up another array to return to you. But it's a lot easier to write this kind of code than to write the equivalent loop. And catch, if there's an error, just reject the deferred. So that was the easy one. If there was a grouping request, we're going to get past the field name, so we're going to load grouped. This is load a grouped set of items from the database, and that's the field we're going to be grouping on. Now, the weird thing about this is, unless you know what we're expecting in DevExtreme, you've got quite a bit of code to write. This is an example group array here. We're expecting an array, or the grouping facility is expecting an array of items, of objects. So there we are. There's two objects in this array. Each object has to have a key property, which is the value of the group. So we're going to be grouping on the done field, for example. So here's the group for done is false, and here's the group for done is true. And then there's an items array within that as well, which has the actual records. So I'm going to be creating this group array as the result of calling load with a load options group with a field name. That's what I'm going to do. And again, I'm going to be doing it in a functional style, and I'm going to be using the reduce method of array. And what the reduce method does is it takes an initial value, sends that as a kind of an accumulator value, shall we say, and sends the accumulator to a function along with each of the items, and the items then basically build up that accumulator. Most people do this as a kind of show an example where reduce is going to produce a sum of the items. So the accumulator is basically a sum value, sum variable, and it's pretty easy to note to create that kind of example. Here I'm going to be using reduce to create an accumulator, which is an array. So that's the initial value of the array is way down here. So the reduce function takes a function to call on every single item, and it takes an initial value for the accumulator. And for every item, it calls this function. It passes in the current value of the accumulator. I'm calling it group array, and here's the current item. So what we do inside this function? Well, we've got to try and find the group that this to-do item is going to apply to. So I'm going to invoke the find method. That requires a function. The function is going to be called for each item, and it is looking for a result value of true. As soon as it gets a result value of true, that's it. The find function finishes and passes back the item that actually passed the test. So here I'm saying, okay, the group item dot key, and if you recall, this is one of the objects. The group item dot key is going to be this value here, and if that is equal to, this is the actual object to do item dot doc, and that is the field name we're looking for. So if the key equals the value of the field name, we're going to return that group. Otherwise, we're going to return null. Undefined. So if the group was found, then we just push our current object onto the items list. If the group wasn't found, we need to take the group array, add a new object of which the property is, the key property is the value of the to-do item object's field name, and then an array of items, of which there's only going to be one in the array to begin with, and that's the object we just found. And the final bit of this function is we'll return the accumulator, or if you like, the group array here. And then we'll resolve that once all that processes, which completes the then, and then it's all part of this promise stuff. So after that lovely bit of code, we're going to make sure that I've set this as the database. Yes, it is. And make sure the other ones are not set. Yes, they are. So we're just going to start that in Firefox. I've done no changes to any other code whatsoever. So all I've done here is create a custom store. The data source doesn't have to change, and the data is also persistent. So this is yet another view of some to-dos. I have the done, where I quote wrote the app, and I still to do. So it's grouped by value, by done value, I should say, and it works in exactly the same way. So let's add a new item here. Finish webinar. Make sure everyone cheers, and save that, and it comes into the still to do list. So PouchDB is a great little JavaScript database because you don't have to worry about the storage. You let it worry about it. It's cross-browser, cross-platform, and it also comes with synchronization to CouchDB on a server somewhere, or some server that supports CouchDB's API. And with that, I'm still working inside a browser. Okay, it's in a simulator inside a browser, but I can certainly start debugging code if something didn't work. And let me tell you, I've been doing a lot of debugging on this. It sounds like I just wrote this in one go, but no, it didn't work out that way, as Paul will readily say, as he heard me crying at night as it wouldn't work. But PouchDB has all these great features, and including synchronization and the ability to, develop and debug inside a quick desktop browser before you even start trying to compile it with Cordova or PhoneGap. So
I think one of the other takeaway values there, Julian, is that utilizing the DevExtreme wrapper around the data store means that you can swap out the technology you want at the back end without killing your core application functionality. So it could be that you start with local store, you find that things are growing, and right, you can then switch to PouchDB or one of the other stores that are out there. But right, once you've implemented that custom store approach, your UI is not going to change. Your main functionality will stay the same. Your work's only happening in the little black box.
Exactly, and with the custom store, you're open to doing everything. I was talking to Paul earlier on saying, well, sometimes data you want to store is very transient, so you'd like to use an array store, and then sometimes you really want to save it, you want to persist it. But with a custom store, you basically have this layer whereby some data is transient, non-permanent, and other stuff is permanent. You hide that from the application itself. The custom store deals with where the data goes, whether it's temporary or whether it's permanent. And that's another great webinar in store, if you like, is the ability to have data which is stored on the device and data which is stored elsewhere. But as you saw, all I was doing basically was switching database engines in a sense. So if I want to go back to the data array, all I was doing basically was making the data array, the array store, the database, and just rerunning it. I wasn't changing any view at all for this to work. So we'll get back the feeding cats thing.
You've got some of the most well-fed cats in history.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, indeed.
It's also nice to see some of the other DevExtreme mobile things happening on screen. Obviously, the skinning for iOS there, switch to Android, the little notifications, and all the other functionality that DevExtreme provides out of the box. So
right,
that's quite nice.
Right.
Now, I don't know, there's only been a couple of questions that I've answered as we've gone through. Okay. Jamie's just asked, can I synchronize some binary types like images? And the short answer is yes. The long answer is it's not that easy. As Julian pointed out earlier, the core thing with a lot of this is being able to put objects into a JSON notation.
Yeah.
Now, if you're talking about storing images, I mean the HTML5 specification does allow you to work with things like photos from the camera app, from the camera on a device, but at that point you're then starting to also look at other plugins and so forth.
Well, you have to serialize it as JSON. You have to serialize it as JSON, basically.
And nobody stores images in databases.
Don't they? Oh, damn.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. It's an interesting point that gets raised when we do our classroom presentations, and some people are big advocates saying, yes, you can store large images in databases, and the DBAs in the room all just bury their heads in their hands.
Indeed, indeed.
So at the moment, there are no other questions. If you switch to the next slide, Mr. Bucknall.
I will. There we go.
There's our contact details, and of course we love to hear from you outside the presentations, and certainly feel free to ask any questions that may not get asked in our live presentation. And the other thing, we want to hear from you as to what sort of presentations you'd like us to cover this year. We've got some DevExtreme presentations coming up. We've got some reporting presentations coming up on how to do some really cool stuff with reports. We've got the debugging for DevExtreme. Julian's going to do the JavaScript functional programming, or otherwise known as JavaScript for Dummies. And there's our esteemed colleagues Mehul and Don are doing a presentation on ASP.NET and queries, more ad hoc queries in your web pages in a couple of weeks. So make sure you take a look at the DevExpress/webinars page and keep up to date with that. Of course, everything we do is always shown on YouTube afterwards, so you can go to our DevExpress YouTube channel and see all our other work. So other than that, I'm not sure if Amanda has anything she wants to add, but we're about ready to wrap up.
All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, like Paul said, you can check out devexpress.com/webinars for all our upcoming webinars and to access previously recorded webinar sessions as well. Our next webinar is Tuesday, March 8th. Give ad hoc query powers to your ASP.NET Grid users. You can join Mehul and Don and learn how to use the new DevExpress ASP.NET Query Builder control. You'll learn how to get started, the controls functionality and limitations, and how it can help you turn your average users into pros by giving them the power to query. And again, today's webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. I already posted the link in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thank you so much to Paul and Julian. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.